Hello American history students, this is Mr. Bandersee and we're going to be walking our way through the contrasting decades note sheet here as we go through these slides. So thanks for joining me, off we go. First off, the 1930s, they were dominated by two events. The first event was the economic depression, and the second event was the Dust Bowl. Okay, you've probably heard of the Great Depression. I'm not sure if you've heard of the Dust Bowl before, but those are the two events, the Depression and the Dust Bowl. The 30s were a dramatic contrast to the previous decade, the 1920s. We talked about the 20s. You can see these two images here. The 20s showing you on the left the lavish lifestyles. People were enjoying life and wanting to be entertained and have lots of leisure time and go out and party. And on the right hand side, this very familiar image, you can see it hanging in my classroom. In fact, a photo by Dorothea Lange and an image of a mother during the Great Depression. So very different images and very different emotions being evoked here in these two images. So now, number 2 on your notes, the reputation of the 20s. Generally, they were considered to be economically prosperous, politically peaceful, and a little socially quirky. And so those things are all true of the 1920s. Economically prosperous, politically peaceful. People weren't really making a stir or reforming much. And socially quirky, we're talking about flappers, jazz music, and things that were kind of breaking from the norm, the traditions. The 1920s, on the other hand, or 30s rather, were a time of great economic hardship, marked by the Great Depression, of course. It was also a time of political activism. People were wanting government to do more, and government was doing more. And lastly, social conservatism, whereas in the 1920s you had people wanting to go out and have a good time and party and enjoy life. In the 1930s, you have much less of that. People are reserved, and if you are wealthy, it's less appropriate to show off that wealth during the 30s because of the Depression. Now let's talk about the main presidents. This is number 3 on your notes. The main presidents of the 20s, I think the main guy we think of is Calvin Coolidge. He was a Republican. He was a man of very few words, had the nickname Silent Cal, and he favored a very limited role for the government. Didn't want the government to do much, and he didn't do much as president. He even vetoed a bill that was going to be helping farmers who were really hurting because he just didn't want the government to get involved. And that was his political philosophy. The government should do very little and just stay out of the way for business to grow and for people to have freedom. The main president of the 30s is pretty different. Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, he talked to the people quite a bit. He was not a man of few words, he was a man of many words, and he would often go before the American people in what became known as the fireside chats, where he would express his solidarity with the people and try to answer their concerns and give them confidence and hope in a time when they needed that. He also supported a very active role for the federal government. He believed in regulating business, doing what they could to create jobs and provide a social safety net so that no one fell through the cracks during the Great Depression, as many people were. So those guys are two very different presidents, Coolidge and Roosevelt. Don't get confused here, there was another Roosevelt president. Remember Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about a couple months ago. This is different, Franklin Roosevelt. Interesting quote I've got for you here. Herbert Hoover spoke these words. Herbert Hoover was president between FDR and Coolidge and president during the crash. He said, "We have come nearer to the abolition of poverty, to the abolition of fear and want than humanity has ever reached before." And almost exactly 1 year later, the stock market crashed, and that sent the world into an economic depression. So let's talk about the stock market crash. The definition of a crash, this is number 5 on your notes, a sudden dramatic decline of stock prices across a significant cross-section of the stock market. Significant cross-section means that it's many different industries being affected, not just the steel industry, not just the auto industry or the agriculture industry or whatever it might be. It's across pretty much all the industries in the market. And stock market crashes are driven by panic as much as underlying economic factors. Sometimes they're not very logical. If people start selling, people get nervous and they start to sell their stocks, it can create panic, and more people will sell and more people, and pretty soon you have a crash. So that may have been what happened. It may have just been panic, but either way, it had devastating effects. Crashes are not quite the same as bear markets. A bear market is another term that you often hear with markets. Well, a crash is panic selling. It's very abrupt and it has dramatic price declines, usually occurring over several days, whereas bear markets have periods of declining stock market prices that are measured in months or years. So maybe a recession, but not a crash. An economic depression is a severe economic downturn in the economy, marked especially by high unemployment. And so that's number 6 on your notes. A severe downturn in the economy marked especially by high unemployment. And high unemployment was, unemployment was very high during the Great Depression. It got up around in the 20s and near 30%. This then was the longest and most severe economic depression ever experienced by the Western world. So it wasn't just in the U.S., but it was bad in the U.S. and the worst we've ever seen. Our recession in 2008 was bad. We're still not totally out of the woods on that. Unemployment is still much higher than we'd like to see, but it was not as bad as the Great Depression, not as bad as the crash of 1929. By late 1932, stock values had dropped to about 20% of their previous value, and by 1933, 11,000 of the U.S.'s 25,000 banks had failed. So this is a very big decline. A lot of banks are going under. We'll talk about banks in a few minutes here. It also had a worldwide impact. The U.S. was a major creditor and financier of post-war Europe. We're talking about World War I, post-World War I. The U.S. financial breakdown precipitated economic failures around the world, especially in Germany and Britain. And how did this affect Germany in particular? Well, it was extremely devastating to them. And the Depression even allowed guys like Adolf Hitler to come to power because people were desperate and they turned to extreme solutions in some cases. We'll talk about that more second semester. So, some major causes now. First of all, let's talk about some economic theory. The theory at the time was that the economy was self-correcting. It needed to go through a period of lower wages and prices before new growth could take place. It was the role of the government then to tighten up the money supply to avoid inflation and not interfere with business. So people were very hesitant to get the government very involved, and especially conservatives thought that the money supply should be tightened so that you didn't get too much inflation. Well, John Maynard Keynes went against that idea, and he was a well-known economist at the time and became more well-known after this and is very well-known today. He believed that the government needed to prime the pump of the economy by increasing the money supply and temporarily running a deficit. So that means spending more than we're taking in. Sounds problematic. That's how we got such a huge debt right now. But it's not always so bad as long as you pay it back. And that's where we really have trouble. So he believed it was okay in a time of depression or recession to temporarily run a deficit, but then after you're out, you do need to pay it back. So this would get people buying and get money out there in the economy, people spending money, and would stimulate growth once again. So now we're going to talk about some specific causes. This is number 9 on your notes. Causes of the crash and depression. First off, monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System turned a small depression into a large one by cutting the money supply by 1/3. So on your notes, maybe you can write cutting money supply by 1/3. With less money to go around, businessmen could not get loans. The Federal Reserve also sat idly by while bank after bank fell. Had they acted by increasing the money supply, the Depression might have just been another recession. So decreasing the money supply was a critical mistake. Decreasing the money supply, you can write that on your notes for letter A, and also maybe letting banks fail. Letter B is debt. The widespread use of home mortgage and credit purchases of automobiles created consumer debt. People were going into debt and they were comfortable with that to buy all the new stuff that was out there. And that was okay for a time. But when the economy went sour, they were now in trouble. They had debt and they had to keep up with those payments on their cars, on their refrigerators, radios, whatever they had bought. And now, because they were making those payments, they couldn't buy new things. The demand for new products went down, and that becomes a crucial factor in the economy not improving. Okay, we want to keep people buying stuff. That helps the economy. All right. Letter C on your notes is the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. A tariff, first of all, is a tax on imports. We would tax imports from other countries, and that would make American-made products a little more attractive to our consumers. All right, so people would be more likely to buy American. It doesn't lower the price of American goods, it raises the price of the foreign goods. So it's not all that bad, but in the Hawley-Smoot tariff, we see it going way too far. Too many tariffs. And other countries retaliated and actually decided they were not going to buy our farm products as a consequence of this. And that caused farmers who are already hurting to hurt even more. A lot of them defaulted on their loans, and that contributes to more banks failing because they can't pay the banks back those loans. Letter D, an uneven distribution of wealth. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy people who saved or invested rather than spent their money on American goods. Thus, supply was greater than demand. So you had, during the 1920s, a lot of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, relatively few, wealthy people. The problem with banks. Well, banks made some mistakes during the 1920s too that led to the problem. They failed to maintain adequate reserves. Now, let's talk about this a second. When you bring let's say you're wealthy and you bring $100,000 to the bank and you want to deposit that in the bank. If you were to come back a week, 2 weeks later, you might not actually be able to get that money out of the bank. You have to give them some notice. They don't have that money. They're not just holding it there in a vault for you. Very often, they are investing that money. That's how they can afford to pay you interest. They invest it in stocks, in bonds, in real estate, and that's good. We want them to do that. But in the 1920s, banks were investing too much of that money, and not enough of it was what we would call liquid or easily accessible. So they were making very risky investments. They were investing too much in the stock market and making loans that were too risky. And now, when the economy is failing, people want to get their money to the bank. They can't. The banks are going under. Number 10 on your notes now. What eventually pulls us out? Well, we won't talk too much about this now. We'll save it for second semester. But finally, we did get out of the Great Depression, and it was because of World War II. Well, it might not seem like a great thing, but a war can actually save an economy because it forces the government to spend lots and lots of money. And when the government's spending money, it stimulates growth. The government's spending money for, they're paying lots of troops. They're spending money for fabric for uniforms, metal for guns, rubber for tires, all sorts of things. And this is stimulating growth, creating jobs that weren't there before. And it eventually leads us out of depression. We talked about John Maynard Keynes and how he thought the government should spend more money than it took in order to stimulate growth and get things going. He wanted FDR to spend more money than he did. It was finally now World War II that forced FDR to spend that money, and it did bring us out of recession. You could argue there was cost with that. a lot of debt,